Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Damon Santola wants you to make big things happen. Let's hear what he has to say. Damon, welcome to The Secrets of Success.
Thank you for having me.
Damon, you've written a book called Change, and you begin by telling us that you're a sociologist who specializes in the study of social networks and how change spreads. Can you tell us how you got into such a focused position?
Yeah, well, the thing to understand is that this is really a brand new science. It's only in the last 15 years that we can actually study society using not just large-scale data, but actually large-scale experiments. For the last last 100 years, really, we've been studying individuals one at a time and then trying to, infer or deduce how things like Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement actually spread across our society and in some cases across the world. And that's led us to a set of, ideas about how change works and how social change spreads. That's really been based on this sort of notion of everything spreading like a virus, really on epidemiology. And what's happened in the last 15 years is that all of a sudden we've been able to sort of do experiments where we can test whether or not that viral theory actually works to explain, interestingly, not just sort of social change and social movements like marriage equality and Black Lives Matter, but even things as sort of seemingly basic as the spread of face masks. And what you notice with the spread of COVID-19 is COVID-19 spread across nations and it spread across political differences and party lines, but face masks didn't. Face masks were, behaviorally constrained by, certain groups and their beliefs. And so it really sort of brings to the forefront this very clear idea now that behaviors spread very differently than information. And the way that I got into this was noticing that when social change takes off, it has certain characteristics. I mean, it has rules that we can study scientifically, which I think is fascinating. But it turns out that the science of diseases isn't the right science for understanding how societies change.
And by the way, for our audience, not only do I find this fantastic, but you also do this for some companies we might have heard of, like Microsoft and Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the interest from the sort of the corporate or the sort of commercial side is that, believe it or not, there are a lot of products that actually are more like social change campaigns than they are like, traditional ad or marketing campaigns. So for some of the classic products that you may know, like, soft drinks or coconut water or, teeth whitening creams, these kinds of products spread in a fairly, basic, almost viral way. And that's why we're familiar with notions like viral marketing. But there are other kinds of products, and then these are usually the ones that we're kind of more interested in when we're trying to explain how they spread, like Facebook, which just kind of took over the planet. And it sort of raises big questions about how a product like that could be so successful. And of course, we have Twitter as well, and Instagram too. And those products are different because they're inherently social. You can't just buy it by yourself. You've got to sort of know what other people in your friendship group are doing. And so they spread in different ways. And the fact that they're like so successful on such a large scale raises new questions about really, again, the science of behavior change and how that spreading process unfolds, because it doesn't look anything like a virus, but it does follow rules. And so that means that companies can adopt certain strategies that make it more likely for something like a new social technology to take off and to catch on. Even though the old rules from epidemiology don't apply, there are new rules from the science of behavior change that help us to understand it.
So if we're interested in getting anybody to change their behavior, for instance, if we're a teacher, a salesman, a pastor, maybe even a dentist or a doctor who just wants us to have good dental health, we better listen to what you're saying. Am I correct?
Well, I think you'll be much more effective and successful if you do. The big breakthrough here really is this sort of, this core distinction. between what I call a simple contagion and a complex contagion. So, this notion that everything spreads like a virus is the sort of classic notion, that's simple contagion. And the new science of behavior spreading is really based on this sort of new phenomenon or this discovery of complex contagion. So to understand the difference, you can think of simple contagion is really the way that COVID-19 spread. Someone can get on a plane in Wuhan, China, who's infected with COVID-19. They can fly to New York and get off the plane in New York. Now, a single person can carry the infection, and then the people they interact with in New York will then become infected. And so that one kind of social link from Wuhan to New York acts as a sort of a carrier for transmitting the disease across continents. And that's sort of the idea of a simple contagion, is it only takes one contact, which means that the more of these sort of links you have going across the world, the faster that something can spread. And of course, that's the danger of disease spreading. And that's also the promise of viral marketing. But, if a person gets on a plane in Wuhan, China, and they're part of a social movement, if they get off the plane in New York, they're not going to spread that social movement to everyone in New York City. The sort of spread of social movements like participation in Black Lives Matter doesn't spread by like one person getting on a plane and then transmitting it to everyone they interact with. There's something else going on. And there's clearly some kind of social reinforcement process where people sort of convince each other to join something like a social protest in the streets, which is, dangerous and has a certain amount of inherent risk in it. And it turns out that like the vast majority of interesting behaviors, everything from the support of marriage equality to wearing face masks, everything has a kind of social risk component to it that makes it spread more like a complex contagion. People pay a lot of attention to the people around them. They're really aware of what others are doing. And as a result of that, just having contact with one person who's adopted new behavior typically isn't enough to convince us that we should do that too, particularly when no one else we know is doing it. And so when we think about the spread of something like a social change movement or even a new social technology that requires coordinating with your peers and friends, you're looking at the people who are adopting, but you're also looking at the people who aren't adopting. And you're kind of weighing that and sort of deciding what feels comfortable in your social group or in your community. And that act of sort of balancing out, the sort of social comfort or the social acceptance of a new behavior is one reason why people pay a lot of attention to sort of all these network influences. And those network influences operate either to hinder behavior, to prevent it from spreading, or to accelerate it, to sort of help it grow. And this really gives rise to one of the biggest lessons from this sort of core distinction between simple and complex contagions, and that's the role of influencers, right? That's the idea of, what role does someone play who's really highly socially connected, who's very charismatic and very popular? How do they, matter in the spread of a new sort of idea or innovation?
And that's what we've been doing for years. Am I correct? Like we hire a star, and I was thinking who I would probably hire, but if I had some new product, I'd probably look at like a Tom Brady or one of the Kardashians and start doing commercials, because if they think it's cool, let's say to wear a blue bow tie, then other people will. But would I be right or would I be wrong?
Yeah, well, for wearing a blue bow tie, it's a real question of whether that's something that's already considered easy to do or whether it's something that's considered kind of weird. So yeah, I mean, that sort of winds up being the thing. So the thing to notice about an influencer is that you don't become a highly connected person by ignoring your social contacts, right? You become a really highly connected social star by paying a lot of attention to the people around you and how they respond to you. You're very attentive to sort of your social group and to the sort of signals that you give off and to how comfortable people are with them. And the difference between sort of the big influencers and the rest of us is that most of us only have a modest number of social contacts, and our sort of friends of friends all know each other. We live in kind of social clusters that aren't highly connected. And I refer to this as the network periphery. It just means the sort of parts of the network that are closer to the outer edges, whereas the influencers are kind of more in the center of the network. They're just, massive social stars. And their networks look like a fireworks explosion. They just have like links heading out in all directions to the periphery and to everywhere else. Whereas the kind of networks that most of us live in are more like fishing nets. They're kind of these sort of, little clusters that kind of bunch together. And the fact that the influencers have so many ties reaching out in all directions, of course, makes them very good for spreading simple contagions. In fact, the very notion of the influencer dates back to sort of early research in the 1940s and 50s on what was called opinion leaders, people who were the sort of conveyors of new commercial information and also new political information to their social network. And that idea actually comes from the sort of notion of a super spreader in epidemiology, someone who, if they get infected with the measles, they know so many people that they're going to infect a lot of people with the measles. And of course, it's the same for COVID-19. And so it's sort of a basic model from simple contagion. And of course, that's true for, it works well to describe, I'm not sure if it works well for blue bow ties, but it certainly works well for describing something like celebrity gossip. That if one of those people becomes sort of, interested in a new piece of information, they can then spread that to a lot of people, and then those people know about it. And this is kind of the word of mouth phenomenon. But now you have to contrast that with the idea that despite the fact that the influencers are really good at spreading simple contagions, and that, companies and marketing campaigns have made use of this for, decades, they're not very good at spreading disruptive new products that sort of force us to change our routines or our behaviors, or, bold new political initiatives that kind of go against the mainstream, or even movements like for sustainability or race and gender equity. And we've seen this. We've seen, really contentious social movements or social movements that are sort of struggling to get off, like the, movement for climate change and sustainability, try to use actors and celebrities to try to initiate social change. And they've had basically no success. And the reason for this is that people's routines are really, embedded in their neighborhoods and the people around them and the people they talk to and interact with daily, more than they are in sort of the message coming from, a celebrity or a social star. And so this means that social change typically tends to take hold, which is interesting and sort of surprising, in the periphery, like in regular people's social networks. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that regular folks who live in kind of like fishing net networks have fewer contacts. So it only takes a couple of reinforcing neighbors or friends to convince them that this sort of new idea is sort of good and has some social support, because they've got fewer people, blocking it, fewer countervailing influences. But also it means that once people sort of start to get a kind of a cluster of reinforcing friends, they can kind of coordinate with each other to convince more people and more people. And this is typically how we see social movements grow, through these kinds of, clusters in the network periphery spreading through this kind of fishing net network. And this is the sort of the growth model that we've seen really for the growth of the civil rights movement, for the growth of Black Lives Matter, for the growth of marriage equality. And, you can just, the list goes on. In fact, the book has hundreds of stories of all these different social change processes that all take hold that same way. And of course, we also have examples of trying to use the influencers to kind of push a social change, even a new or disruptive product into a population, and how colossally it fails. And probably my favorite example of this, which I talk about in the book, is Google Glass.
Damon, before we go into that, I'll pick that up. I'd just like our audience to know that if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Today we're talking with Damon Centola. He's the author of the book, Change: How to Make Big Things Happen. Damon, can you tell us where we can get the book and if there's a website where we can find out more?
Yeah, the book's available at every major bookseller, and the website that provides kind of an overview of the book and all the different outlets is damoncentola.com. So it's just my name.com.
We'll ask you that information again before the end of the show. And to our audience, obviously in this era, when so many issues are coming up, whether it's medical, political, new products that are coming out, you'll be fascinated by this book. It's a fun read. It's one that even I can understand. So to our audience, I'm sure you can understand it too. Get hold of the book, Change, by our guest, Damon Centola. Now, Damon, I interrupted you. Please continue. You were talking about, I think it was Amazon.
Well, I was talking about Google. And one of the interesting things with Google's sort of initiatives to sort of change society by introducing new products that were sort of different from anything that was available before, is that they tended to use kind of the classic marketing strategies, the sort of make a product that's sticky, that's, fun, that's memorable, that's easy to talk about, that has all the properties of, what's supposed to be a viral product. And Google Glass is a really good example of this. Glass was like a cyborg technology. It was a pair of glasses for those, who don't remember. But most of us do. It's a pair of glasses that allows you to kind of interact digitally with your immediate environment. And also to sort of, surf the web while you're looking through your glasses, and to record that, the information in your visual field as well. And Google was really excited about this. They thought this was going to, this idea of wearable technology, of interactive eyewear, was just going to sort of revolutionize, every industry and social life more generally. And so they pushed it really hard, with ad campaigns. But one of the main strategies was to sort of find influencers, highly connected, high profile people, often in the Bay Area, who were these sort of social leaders in the sort of space of cultural innovation and sort of socio-technical sophistication. And it's a strategy, this idea of, adopting high profile people to be innovators for a new product. It's an idea that's very similar to the sort of the status products like, Ferrari and Rolex, where you sort of get people who can afford $1,500 eyeglasses, get them to wear them publicly, and then you make a big sort of campaign about it, make the product memorable and interesting to talk about. And then presumably, with influencers plus, virality plus stickiness, this thing should just take off and take hold. And what happened, of course, sort of famously is the opposite. What happened was that there was this enormous social backlash because what Google Glass did was it sort of contradicted or really ran into people's existing social norms about what was appropriate in face-to-face interactions. It seemed rude for people to, browse the web while they were talking to someone directly, or more importantly, it violated people's sense of privacy rights, that you could, record people's conversations or record them without knowing it. And so it really had backfired in several ways. First of all, there was so much social backlash against the product that actually the entire product line was canceled. And, a new social term emerged. People would refer to people who wore glass as, quote unquote, glass holes. And the rest of the people in the world who wouldn't wear glass were like regular folks. And it created this like bizarre, almost culture war between sort of Google product wearers and everyone else. And of course, that's death for a product. But not only was the product line canceled, but actually Google's company reputation was hurt. Because before they released Glass, they were like this very cool, cutting edge, top-notch technology company. And they used, obviously, as we all know, they used the search engine on site to celebrate, women and minorities in the arts and sciences and sort of interesting topics. And after that, Google became known as kind of a juggernaut in Silicon Valley that sold surveillance technology to the rich. And so it really sort of hurt the company's reputation. And this is one of the ways in which the sort of strategy of using influencers and kind of viral marketing can backfire when what you're trying to spread is actually a complex contagion, right? It works well for a simple contagion, something we can just adopt without thinking about it. But when there's some social risk, some social resistance to this idea, it's going to be much more successful if it grows in the network periphery than if it's tried, if people try to spread it from the sort of highly connected influencers.
Damon, when you talk to people, and obviously not only do you teach at an Ivy League school, but you're dealing with the major companies in the world, do the executives and let's say the high-powered professors and super intelligent people that you're talking to usually on a regular basis, do they have any idea what influences them, or do they fall into the great mass, almost like a football stadium, that they either buy the product the guy next to them buys, or the woman next to them recommends, or do they ask their sister what perfume is best?
Yeah, so this is one of the really interesting topics I think that I sort of explored in depth while writing this book, which is the degree to which people even understand or know that they're being influenced socially. There was this great study at Princeton about a decade ago in which some of my colleagues asked a bunch of Princeton undergrads to evaluate a series of new proposals for the university. And what they did was to sort of show other people's responses. And they got the sort of answer you'd expect to get, which is that undergrads tended to gravitate towards the policies that other people also supported. And that's the kind of standard, people are influenced by other people type of thing that we're used to from social science. But they took it a step further, and then they asked respondents to tell them about other people. They said these people chose the same responses as the other people on our survey. What do you think motivated them? And then they also asked people what motivated themselves. And when people were responding as to their own motivations, they said, "Oh, well, I'm motivated by the fact this is a good policy," or I'm motivated by the fact that I think this is the best thing for the university. And then when they were sort of responding or guessing about other people's motivations for choosing the same policies, they said, "Oh, I think those people were influenced by their peer group and by the other fact that other people were choosing those policies." So what's so interesting is that people are good at sort of guessing about other people's behavior and the influence of social norms. But when it comes to their own behavior, we actually tend to attribute our motivations to something sort of intrinsic, like our preferences or our reasoning.
I find your book, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I find it so interesting that I want to make sure our audience gets this part of it. And I just want to stop for a second and let them know that they're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. But the key information today is our guest, Damon Centola. He has written a book called Change. And if you find this as fascinating as I do, you definitely want to read more and find out more information. So Damon, would you tell us where we can get the book and if there's a website where we can find out more information?
Sure. The book is available at every major bookseller. And the website that sort of gives a basic overview of the book and where to find it is damoncentola.com.
And the title couldn't be easier. You don't have to remember a lot of words. Change. That's what we want to do when we meet somebody. We want them to think the way we do or buy our product or at least listen to what we have to say if we're a teacher. So there it is in one word, change. Damon, can you tell us some of the myths that people follow concerning change that now through your studies we're learning are just inaccurate?
Yeah, so there are basically three big myths that come from, like I said originally, the last 100 years of science. And the scientific work that's come before me has been really good stuff. It's very thoughtful, very interesting scientific work. It's just that we haven't really had the sort of the tools and the methods to study what makes change actually spread. And so we've basically taken a bunch of lessons from this, the science of diseases. And, lesson number one is that everything is viral. And I refer to this as the myth of virality because it turns out that what's viral are viruses. Certain kinds of information can spread like viruses. And that's kind of the word of mouth phenomenon. But by and large, the vast majority of behaviors, and that really goes for everything from social movements to, the spread of new technologies, don't spread virally. They spread in this sort of more complex way. The second myth is the myth of stickiness. And that actually also comes from the science of diseases, which is the notion that certain, diseases or pathogens are a little bit more infectious than others, and therefore they're likely to catch on and spread, like COVID-19. And so we've kind of translated that idea into the notion of, social movements and products, which is that you can just sort of make them compelling, memorable, engaging, and therefore people will want to buy them. But it turns out that, in fact, that strategy can backfire when there's really strong social resistance to a new idea. The more sort of memorable and compelling you make it, the easier it is for people to be very clear about the fact that they don't like it because it's so distinct from what they're used to. And then the third myth, which follows from both the myth of virality and the myth of stickiness, is the big ones, the myth of the influencer. And that's, again, been around really since the 1940s, this idea that there are special people. And if we can just find those special people, they're so highly connected that they'll, influence everyone around them to adopt a new behavior. And the real problem with that is that if a behavior is socially risky or uncomfortable or difficult, a highly connected person has a lot of people watching them. They have a lot of people observing their behavior and commenting on their behavior. So these people are typically reluctant to be sort of on the cutting edge of something that's, not quite popular yet. And so those people, actually, the influencers tend to be, the sort of later adopters in a spreading process. Whereas the early adopters and the kind of change process tends to take hold out, in the outskirts of the periphery of the social network. And this is a big lesson because it changes really all of our strategies for like where and how to initiate change. And the most important thing it does is it changes the way we think and talk about sort of strategy from finding special people, which is really the idea of finding influencers. And that's the way we've thought about it, to finding special places. And this is really looking at the social network as kind of the key to sort of initiating change and these sort of overlapping structures, these kind of fishing nets in the network. If we can find those spots, the people may just be regular everyday folks, but if the sort of innovation takes hold among them, then that's how it sort of starts to spread around the sort of community and then the country and then the world. And this is exactly how something like Twitter spread, which is so surprising because you think of Twitter as the kind of thing that, a high profile person adopts and everyone adopts. But actually, it was a neighborhood technology that spread from like community to community to community and then eventually grew to sort of a nationwide tipping point and then sort of globally. And so that kind of history, once we understand it scientifically, gives us an entirely new approach to initiating change.
Damon, you've been great. And what I'm getting from that, and I feel pretty good about it, is that maybe I'm not Tom Brady and I'm certainly not one of the Kardashians, but maybe I have more power within a group and the small groups that I'm in to help initiate change or get some bad practices out of the way. And hopefully that's the truth. And I'll be a little more aware of what I'm doing on a day-by-day basis. Before we wrap up, I'd like to let our audience know that once again, we've been speaking with Damon Centola, Centola. His book is easy to remember. The title is Change, How to Make Big Things Happen. And Damon, can you tell us where it's available?
Yeah, the book is available really at every major bookseller, but the sort of overview of the book and sort of some of the links to the booksellers can be found on my website, which is damoncentola.com.
And again, I'll give you my critique, a fascinating book, a lot of fun to read, and it's going to make you very interesting next time you're sitting someplace and want to strike up a conversation because you're going to know all about change and you're going to shock the people around you. Damon, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, it's been my pleasure.
Damon would like to let our audience know that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we will continue our journey to success.